Welcome back, friends! In this quiz, can you guess the place just by looking at its famous monuments? Let's find out, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Alright, let's begin. The Eiffel Tower is located in Paris. The Great Wall of China is in which country? Yes, it's in China. The Taj Mahal can be found in India. Machu Picchu is located in which country? Peru. The Statue of Liberty is in USA. The Colosseum is in which city? Rome. The Sydney Opera House is located in Australia. The Burj Khalifa is in which country? United Arab Emirates. Christ the Redeemer statue is in Brazil. Angkor Wat is located in Cambodia. The pyramids of Giza are in Egypt. Big Ben is in London. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Italy. The Forbidden City is in which country? China. The Acropolis is in Greece. Mount Rushmore is located in USA. Petra is a historical site in Jordan. The Alhambra is in Spain. The Brandenburg Gate is located in Berlin. The Parthenon is in Athens. The Moai statues are on Easter Island. The Kremlin is located in Moscow. The Hagia Sophia is in Istanbul. Neuschwanstein Castle is in Germany. Mount Fuji is located in Japan. Stonehenge is in England. The Louvre Museum is in Paris. The Blue Mosque is in Istanbul. Sagrada Familia is in Barcelona. The Golden Gate Bridge is in San Francisco. The Palace of Versailles is located in France. The CN Tower is in Toronto. Chichen Itza is in Mexico. The Gateway Arch is in St. Louis. The Empire State Building is in New York. The Sistine Chapel is in Vatican City. The Hollywood sign is in Los Angeles. The Temple of the Emerald Buddha is in Bangkok. The Meenakshi Temple is in India. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jerusalem. The Cliffs of Moher are in Ireland. Buckingham Palace is in London. The Arc de Triomphe is in Paris. The Terracotta Army is in China. The Doge's Palace is in Venice. The White House is in Washington, D.C. The Hoover Dam is in Nevada. The Shwedagon Pagoda is in Myanmar. The Space Needle is in Seattle. The Lotus Temple is in India. Thanks for playing. Hope you had fun. Check out these other videos we know you'll love. See you next time.